we said that, why don't we like monopoly? Well, we don't. There's several ways we could say it, but the most concise would be, we don't like monopoly because it creates inefficiency. It creates a deadweight loss. Remember, we said that under competitive conditions, we end up at a point such as this, where the price that's being charged is just equal to the marginal cost of producing the product. And we said, from an efficiency standpoint, that's where we would like to be, because let's say the price is $20. Well, if we're here, the price is $20, we are consuming out to the quantity where that very last unit is worth $20 to a consumer, and the cost of producing that last unit, the marginal cost, is also 20. So we're getting surplus. We're getting a net gain on all of the units out to that quantity. So we're glad we're producing all those units. We don't want to produce more. If we produce more, the benefit of the extra unit would be less than the cost, and that would make us worse off. So under competition, if we don't have any externalities, we get the optimal or the efficient quantity being produced, which is exactly where we want to be. And it's great because the government doesn't have to figure anything out. All the producers are just doing what is best for them. Consumers are doing what's best for them. And yet we get this consumer surplus, which is as great as it can possibly be. We love competition because it gives us an efficient use of resources under most conditions, and it benefits consumers. The price is as low as it can be, and the firms still cover all of their costs. We talked about the elimination principle, that in a competitive market, if firms are making profit, that profit, remember what it leads to. Profit leads to entry. When you have new firms coming in, then the price gets pushed down and the profit is eliminated. In a competitive industry, profit gets pushed to zero because the price gets pushed down to the average cost. And that's great for consumers. Now, producers, they don't really like that outcome because their high profits will be eliminated. They have to work hard just to survive. But it's great for consumers. It's great for efficiency. Okay? What's the problem with monopoly? The problem with monopoly is that what is in the best interest of the producer is no longer in the best interest of consumers. Okay? Under competition, producers are trying to maximize profit, and that leads us to that optimal outcome. But with monopoly, the producer maximizes his profit by finding where MR and MC are equal. So even though you got the same demand curve here that we had under competition, you got the same cost curves that we had over here. Because the firm is a monopoly, he knows if I want to sell more, I have to cut my price. And the fact that he has to cut his price is what causes marginal revenue to be less than the price. Supposed to be less than the price. And that's why the MR curve lies below the demand curve. Okay. So the monopolist is going to produce where MR equals MC. That's right here. What do you do with that point? Remember the process. You read down to the axis. That's the quantity the monopolist is going to produce. What price will he charge? Well, you read up to the demand curve. You read over. That's the price the monopolist is going to produce. And you can see the effects. Clearly, consumers are a lot worse off because consumer surplus is reduced to that area. It was this huge area. Consumer surplus is much smaller. Consumers are a lot worse off. They're getting a smaller quantity than they would get under competition, and they're having to pay the higher price. Okay? The monopolist is a lot better off than were the competitive firms, because the competitive firms were making no profit. But for the monopolist, his price is up here, his average cost is down here. So this rectangle represents the extra profit that the monopolist is getting. So we see that the consumer is worse off, the monopolist is better off, but notice the deadweight loss. Okay, it's not just that we like consumers. Okay, it's that when a competitive market is monopolized, the gain to the producer is much smaller than the loss to the consumer. Okay? The consumer is losing all of this. Okay? The profit is just a transfer from the consumer to the producer, but the deadweight loss is the measure of inefficiency. It's a loss to society that nobody is getting. And so that's why we don't like monopoly. It leads to inefficiency. It hurts the consumer, and the loss to the consumer is a lot greater than the loss to, or than the gain to the monopoly. Okay. We also started talking about the sources of monopoly. Why is it that sometimes we have a competitive industry and sometimes we have a monopoly? What are the conditions that lead to that? We talked about patents. If you have a drug where a company has done research and they have a patent, that means that for a period of time they are the only firm that can legally produce the product. So that is a monopoly caused by the patent, but there are other possible causes of monopoly. One was economies of scale. The firm is experiencing economies of scale if, as it expands production, its average costs are declining. So if we have a firm, our typical firm, we believe the average cost curve is going to look like that. Anytime you see a graph, you want to ask yourself or remind yourself, what is that graph telling me? Don't ever look at a graph and not think anything. Okay? The key to understanding these graphs is every time you look at it, think about what it's telling you. That U shape is telling you that if the firm produces a tiny amount, its average costs are going to be very high. But as it expands, largely because of its fixed cost, as it expands, it's able to spread those fixed costs over a larger and larger quantity. And so the firm's average cost is getting lower. And we would say during this interval, or over this interval where average cost is going down, the firm is experiencing economies of scale. Typically, though, the firm reaches some quantity where average cost is a minimum, it's the low point, and if the firm expands and gets bigger and bigger, its average cost start going up. Over this initial interval, we would say the firm is experiencing economies of scale. And then with this upward sloping part, we would say the firm is experiencing diseconomies of scale. Okay. Which of the following is most likely to be a natural monopoly? Well, natural monopoly is very closely connected to economies of scale. Here we showed that typically a firm will experience economies of scale, but then even when it's still a relatively small firm, it starts to experience these diseconomies and the AC starts to go up. But in some cases, especially things like utilities, electricity production, water distribution, railroads here. In these industries, the firm tends to have extremely high fixed cost, which means that the AC curve tends to get lower, or average cost tends to get lower and lower. The curve continues to be downward sloping, even out to the quantity where the firm is serving everybody in the market. That's really what a natural monopoly is. It's where over the entire range of relevant output, average cost is continuing to be downward sloping. In those kinds of situations, you're only going to end up with one firm in the market. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Another source of monopoly, something called barriers to entry. And this is kind of a fuzzy concept. There are a number of things that can constitute a barrier to monopoly. The basic idea is pretty simple. Factors that increase the cost to new firms of entering the industry is something where, because of this factor, it becomes very difficult or very costly for new firms to enter the market. And there are a number of things your book talks about. Ownership of an input that is difficult to duplicate. If you were in the oil refining industry, and if you could control all of the oil, okay, well, nobody else can produce gasoline, for example. If you control all of the oil, then that is a barrier to others entering the market for gasoline, because if they don't have the input, they can't produce the product. Brands and trademarks. Let's say there's a product that the firms are making a lot of profit in that market, okay? And you think, well, we'll take an example. Let's say Coke. I don't really remember how profitable Coke is these days, but let's just make it hypothetical. Let's say that Coke is making phenomenal profits, okay? And you have a company and you think, well, we could make Coke. We could figure out how to make well, you couldn't make Coke, but you could make a substitute for Coke. Would it be feasible for you to go in and start producing that product? Well, it might be, but one of the difficulties that you're going to have is that Coca-Cola is a brand that is widely known. People all over the world, they know what a Coke is. They like Coke. And so when if you start producing your product, call it brand X, when people are thirsty, they see I can buy Coke, which I've had a million Cokes. I know I like Coke. Or I can buy brand X. I don't know what it is. Okay? Well, they might choose to buy your product, but they might not. The fact that Coke has a brand that is highly recognized and valued by customers becomes a real obstacle to you. And before you enter this market, you may say, I think we could produce a product that would be just as good as Coke, but we would have to overcome the loyalty that people have for Coke. And even though I think we might be able to do it, there's a good chance you might not be able to do it. And so you might choose to not enter that market simply because of the brand that exists and people's loyalty. They already know what it is. Okay? Part of it is just information. They know what a Coke is. They know when they take the top off what it's going to taste like. And that's a very valuable thing for consumers, because they don't have to buy something they don't know what it is. It's a very valuable thing for the company, for Coke. People are willing to pay them more because of that brand name, but it does make it more difficult for new firms to enter and compete with Coke. Now, we've got to be careful here. We said that we don't like monopoly. Monopoly causes inefficiencies. Monopoly hurts consumers. And we're identifying these various sources of monopoly. Okay? That might cause you to think that, well, all of these sources, these are bad things. And no, that's not necessarily true. Coke, why is that brand valued so highly? It's because they have spent years providing a product that people like. So they've been doing something good. We're not saying that by developing a brand with a good reputation, we're not saying that's a bad thing. Okay? We are saying that when that happens, it can give that company some monopoly power. And when that happens, it does lead to some degree of the inefficiency that we have talked about. So, yes, brands can lead to, can be a barrier to entry, can lead to more monopoly power than you otherwise would have. But we're not saying that brands are a bad thing. They have value. And then also what you see here, the calculator, development of a relationship with the market. Texas Instruments spent a lot of time and money teaching teachers how to use this calculator. Okay? And once the teachers know how to use that calculator, what kind of calculator are the teachers going to tell their students to get? They're going to say, get the Texas Instruments calculator. Well, maybe Casio or some other HP company has a calculator that would be just as good as this one. There's a significant barrier to entry here because the teachers have a preference for the TI. And so they are going to recommend that to their students, and that it becomes a huge barrier to other companies who want to compete with Texas Instruments. Doesn't mean that Texas Instruments has done something bad or something that's illegal. We're just pointing out that to the extent that they do this good thing, they develop a relationship with the market, it will also have the effect of creating a barrier to entry, which does move the market more in the direction of a firm having significant market power. Related to that, something called network effects. Okay? Network effects make a product or service more valuable the more users there are. And I think your book is they're kind of on the cutting edge because they have a whole chapter on network effects. That's, I think, chapter 16. I'd encourage you to read that. I think it's very good. It's very useful to understand, and you're not going to find it in many other textbooks. So I'd encourage you to read it. There won't be anything on the test about it, but it is useful to be aware of. Think about Facebook. You go to Facebook to communicate with people you know. If a new company comes along that has could offer valuable services, okay, maybe just as good as Facebook, you would be reluctant to go there because if it's new, then none of your friends are going to be on that new company. So if you want to connect with them, you have to go with the existing company where your friends are. Now, the new company could be viable if lots of people go there, okay? But individually, when you're thinking about, well, which company are you going to use, you're going to have an incentive to go to the company where everybody else is already going there. This is a same thing with credit cards. You want to use a credit card that is accepted by lots of businesses. And businesses, they want to use a credit card that lots of consumers have. So if somebody starts a new credit card company, they try to get a business to accept their card, well, the business can say, well, how many credit cards have you issued? And they say, well, we haven't actually issued any credit cards yet. Well, then why should that company start develop a relationship with that company? Okay? You have an incentive to continue to use the existing company. Network effects are really very interesting, and it's a new kind of analysis that is being developed. Another source of a barrier to entry would be innovation. Now, we're not saying innovation is a bad thing. Innovation is a very good thing. Innovation is where a business is looking at opportunities. They're looking at the market as it exists, and they're trying to identify new opportunities. This is an incredible time for innovation to occur, because we have a world that's very different from the world we had 6 weeks ago. So there are all kinds of opportunities out there. One way to look at it, all kinds of opportunities for a business to make profit. But the other way to look at it is there are all kinds of opportunities for a business to figure out better ways of providing things consumers want. And a market creates incentives for that innovation to occur. I saw one story of a restaurant that obviously their business had dropped to almost nothing because they were not allowed to be open. But they, because they were a restaurant, they had all of these food products coming in that they would use normally to produce food. Now they can't sell the food. So they were thinking, we got this facility here, our dining room, we got this food coming in. People still want to eat, but they can't come here and eat. So what can we do? Well, they were trying to convert themselves into a grocery store. They would take the food that they had ordered, that they could get, and then they were trying to figure out how they could package it in a form that consumers would want to buy. And so even though consumers couldn't come and sit down and eat there, consumers could come to it as a grocery store, and they could purchase things that are there. Market economy, if you recognize new opportunities to give people what they want, you can make, you benefit people, okay? You benefit your consumers, and you make a lot of profit for yourself. So even though that, very difficult times, it's also the case, it is a time where there are a lot of opportunity out there. Think about all the people who normally would be out at their job, would be out going places, doing things. Now they're sitting at home. Well, if you're sitting at home, you're using your time and you're using your money differently than before. So as a business, you want to think about all those millions of consumers using their time and their money differently. What can you provide them that they would value, that they would be willing to pay for? And if you can come up with something, then you benefit them and you make profit for yourself. Okay? So all that's talking about innovation. Innovation is a good thing, okay? But it does have an effect on the extent of market power that firms have. When you innovate, then you create a product that is new, and other firms will not be able to immediately duplicate it. So as soon as you create this new product, you have, in some sense, a monopoly because there's no good substitute for it. So when you have innovation, it's in a sense creating new monopolies, and that the innovation is beneficial. The monopoly aspect does mean we don't get quite as much of that new innovation as we would like. Okay, and that's what they mean when they say there's a trade-off here. For example, iPhones. Okay? Apple has been incredibly innovative. Okay, and so they provided a product that is consumers think is better than other phones. I can't say with from personal experience because I don't have an iPhone. I can't afford an iPhone, but they are priced higher than if there were stronger competitors. If there were a lot of other companies that were producing a phone that was just as good as the iPhone, then iPhone prices would come down. Okay? But if they weren't making the profit they're making, then they would not have as much incentive to innovate. Okay, so it's kind of a tricky conclusion here that innovation does create some monopoly power. It does push us in the direction of, you might say, short-run monopolies, but it is a good thing. Okay, it creates products that people value very highly. Consumers benefit from those things. Yes, you have a degree of monopoly in the short run, but as other firms are trying to innovate, they will look for ways to match your innovation, and ultimately you get a competitive outcome. All right. Other sources of monopoly. We've talked about some of these here. I want to focus now on the first one listed here. Laws preventing entry of competitors. Okay? This is really a very serious source of monopoly. If we've talked about how under competitive conditions, profit tends to be eliminated, and firms don't like that. If you're producing in a competitive market, you may be able to earn high profits temporarily, okay? But new firms are going to come in, they're going to compete with you, price is going to go down. Those high economic profits are going to be eliminated over time. You don't like that. You would like something that would enable you to continue making those high profits in the long run. Okay? And if you're thinking about this, you're going to be thinking, well, how can there be some kind of barrier to entry that will prevent these new firms from coming in and competing with me? And one of the most effective things that firms have done is to get the government to pass laws that make it hard for new firms to enter the market. There are, it's not just businesses, but there are a lot of occupations where in order to provide a certain service, you have to get permission from the government. There are a few examples that would seem reasonable and some don't. One example would be physicians. If you, let's say you got a Boy Scout merit badge in first aid, you think, well, I could be a doctor. I could provide medical services to people. Okay? Should you be allowed to put up your sign and say, I'm a doctor? Okay? Well, if you do, most people would not come see you, but there may be a few people who do come and seek medical care from you, and you may prescribe some bad treatment, and as a result, their health suffers. Okay? So the government says, no, we're not going to let just anybody be a doctor. If you're going to provide medical care for people, then you have to meet certain requirements. You have to go graduate from an approved um, hospital or medical program. You have to pass certain tests. You have to demonstrate that you are qualified. Okay? And my guess is that most people would say, well, that's a good idea. We don't want unqualified doctors. But recognize that when we do put up these requirements, that to be a doctor, you have to jump through certain hoops, that also has the effect of reducing the supply of that product. Okay? Because how many doctors are we going to have? Well, that's going to depend on how many get through medical school, and that's going to depend on how many medical schools there are and how many classes the schools require their students to take. So even if you believe that having laws like that are a good idea, recognize that the price of medical services is going to depend on supply and demand. And to the extent that you make it harder for people to go into that occupation, that reduces the supply, and that is going to tend to push the price up. Okay? Maybe it's a good idea for the government to decide who's qualified and who isn't to be a doctor. But recognize, even if that is a good idea, it still will have the effect of decreasing the supply and pushing prices up. Okay. There are lots of other services where government licensing is required. If you want to be you want to run a funeral home, you have to get a certain certification from the government. If you want to style hair, you have to go to a government approved cosmetology program. Very interesting story a few years back of a girl who was a great entrepreneur. She was still in college. She had started her own hair place, and the only thing they did was braid hair. So if you wanted your hair braided, you could go there. She could do it. Her people could do it. She had started a number of outlets. So she was really growing. She was received an award for being Entrepreneur of the Year. But she did not have, had not graduated from a cosmetology school. So because of the publicity she got from winning this award, she received a notice from the state cosmetology board that she would not be prosecuted as long as she shut down all of her stores and did not reopen until she had graduated from cosmetology school. That's really interesting because cosmetology school does not teach braiding. So she could go through that program. She wouldn't be taught how to produce her product. And yet the government is saying, if you want to provide this service, then here's a hoop you have to jump through. Anytime you have that kind of licensing requirement, it will have the effect that we see here. It will reduce supply and it will tend to push the price up. If you want to be a plumber, okay, maybe you know a lot about plumbing services. You cannot provide that service to people unless you have been approved by the government. You have jumped through the licensing requirements that are demanded by the state in which you are operating. One of the maybe the worst examples of this, and there literally are hundreds or thousands of occupations where government restricts the supply or restricts who can go into it, and that limits opportunity for the people involved. But one of the most interesting is to be a taxi driver. In New York City, since I believe the 1930s, if you wanted to be a taxi driver, it wasn't enough that you had a vehicle, that you knew how to drive. Okay? You had to have a vehicle, you had to know how to drive, you had to pass an exam that demonstrated you had the skills needed by a taxi driver. But even more importantly, you had to have a medallion, which you had to display on your taxi. That medallion was proof that you had the legal right from the New York City to operate a taxi in New York City. Okay? And they issued a fixed limited number of medallions back, I think it was the 1930s. And they did not issue any additional medallions until relatively recently. If you, let's say that you're in New York City, you want to drive a taxi, you've got a vehicle, you say, hey, this is something I can do. You pass the chauffeur's test, or the taxi driver test, that's not too much of a problem. But in order to offer your services as a taxi, you have to acquire one of these medallions. And I forget what year it was that the value of the medallion peaked. I believe it was around 2013. These medallions were selling for $1.3 million each. That means you had to pay $1.3 million to get the medallion that gave you the right to operate a taxi. Okay? The taxi didn't come with that. Okay? You had to buy the taxi, and then you had to pay $1.3 million to get the medallion that would give you the legal right to operate that taxi. Okay? This was simply the New York City creating what was effectively a cartel, a limited group of people who could act like a monopoly. And there's no doubt that this decreased the supply of taxis in New York City, and that pushed the price way up. Something really important has happened in the last few years, though, relative to this, and that is the development of Uber. Okay, what does Uber do?
What taxis do.
I'm sorry?
They do what taxis do.
They do what taxis do. Okay? Legally and technically, they don't do what taxis do. Okay? Because anytime you have these government regulations, they're going to be very specific about what they're regulating. So technically and legally, the Uber driver is doing something different from what the taxi driver is doing. But because the Uber legally is providing a different service, that means that you could be an Uber driver without having a medallion. So the development of Uber made it possible for people to provide transportation services that previously could only be provided by taxi drivers. So Uber was a way to get around this restriction. And as a result, the value of these medallions has dropped precipitously. Okay? And if it becomes clear that Uber is not going to be restricted, then at some point the value of these medallions will drop to zero. The last I heard, I think they dropped to around $100,000 per medallion, because people are still hoping that they may be able to restrict Uber, and that would bring back some of the value of the medallion. It's very clear that the medallion is just a way to create some monopoly power for the taxi drivers. And anytime you have monopoly, that creates profits. And that means that people have an incentive to find a way to get into that market, to enter that market. And Uber, because it's not technically a taxi service, was able to get into it, and it's just had a devastating effect on the value of these medallions. It's a great thing that I think that Uber is getting into this market. It's making the market much more efficient, and it's benefiting consumers. Prices are dramatically lower for taxi services than they were before. But and it provides opportunities for lots of people to earn income that they otherwise would not have. But even though I think it is a great thing that Uber has developed, should also point out that there are losers, because you have some people who are longtime taxi drivers who borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars to invest in a medallion. And they said, this is an investment. This is what I do for a living, and I'm going to buy this medallion, and I'll be able to earn money for the rest of my life. And they thought it was a good investment, but they didn't anticipate the development of Uber. And now, because of Uber, price of taxi services has had to go dramatically lower, and you got these individuals who have lots and lots of debt, and rates are so low they can't pay off those the debt they had when they bought the medallion. So it's a tragedy for those people, but it is a good development for society and for the efficiency of how we use our resources. Anytime the government is restricting output, that is going to create problems for efficiency and problems for consumers. Okay, moving on. Regulating monopoly. We talked about the problems that occur when we have a monopoly. Well, what can be done to deal with those problems? One is price controls, one is government ownership, one is antitrust law. Should also put up here, one option is for government to do nothing. Okay. Monopoly is not the outcome that is optimal. It's not what we dream about, but sometimes that is the best alternative. But let's look at each of these separately. Price controls. This would be like a natural monopoly, where here we're assuming that the firm has a constant marginal cost. You can see here that, well, just to ask you, how do we know this looks like a natural monopoly? Well, it's because of the shape of the AC curve. It continues to get lower and lower, even as the firm is getting larger and larger. Here we have the market demand curve. So even at this output where this one firm is satisfying the demand of all the consumers in the market, its average costs are still going down. This is likely to be because they had huge fixed cost in starting their business, something like a railroad. And so as they serve more and more customers, they're able to spread their output over a larger, or spread those fixed costs over a larger and larger quantity. Now, in terms of what we would like, okay, remember efficiency, we would like to be where the price and marginal costs are equal, okay? And that would actually be out here. That would be the efficient quantity. In our dreams, that's where we would like to be. But that can never happen with this a market where the cost curve looks like this. Notice let's say that's $2 per unit. Okay? If the firm was charging $2 and was producing out here, okay, notice their average cost would be something higher than $2, say $3. So although this is, in a sense, the efficient quantity, it can't happen, because if the firm were charging that price, producing this quantity, they would be losing money. They would not be able to survive. Okay. Well, what can we do potentially? What could the government do? They could have a price control. They could tell the monopolist, we're not going to let you set the price. We're going to let you be a monopoly, but we are going to tell you what price you can charge. And in theory, the regulated price, that's what the PR stands for, they would choose a price that would put us right here. Okay. That's not the efficient quantity, clearly, but it's pretty close. Right? And it's higher than we would get under monopoly. Remember, if we have an unregulated monopoly, remember what that firm is going to do. It's going to produce where MR and MC are equal. MC is here, MR is here. So the unregulated monopolist says, that's the point I want to be at. I'm going to produce this quantity. I'm going to charge this price, okay? And I'm going to make a significant amount of profit. Okay, I'm going to charge high price. I'm going to make a monopoly profit. We're going to have a deadweight loss, okay, due to monopoly, because we're only getting this quantity produced. We'd really like to be way out here. Okay. So all the potential gain that we could be having, consumer surplus and producer surplus, we're not getting that because we are at this monopoly level of output. The alternative we're looking at here with the price control, the government says, no, we're not going to let you set your own price. We're going to tell you, you have to charge this regulated price. The government could set the price at a level where the price is just equal to the firm's average cost. Okay? If they do that, then it looks like we're going to get this quantity, which is better than the monopoly, unregulated monopoly quantity. The price consumers pay is going to be a lot lower, and the consumer surplus that consumers are going to get will be a lot higher. So in theory, it looks like a price, a regulated price could work. I would say there's a big problem with that, in that at what level is the government setting the price? They're setting it equal to the firm's average cost. How does the government know what the firm's average cost will be at this level of output? Well, the government has to ask them. So think about this. The government is telling the monopolist, we're going to let you charge a price equal to your average cost. So tell us what your average cost is. Well, here, let's say that the average cost is actually $3. What incentive does the monopolist have to honestly tell the government our average cost is $3? Why not say our average cost is $5, $10? Okay? The monopolist, the government has to depend on the monopolist for the price, for the cost information, and the monopolist does not have an incentive to honestly give them that information. Another problem with using a regulation of monopoly is that if the government is saying we're going to set your price equal to average cost, the government is in effect saying, we're going to make sure that your economic profit is zero. We're going to let you cover your cost, but we're not going to let you make any profit. Okay? Think about what that does to the firm's incentives. In a competitive market, a firm wants to innovate. They want to find a way to lower their cost, because if they can lower their cost, they make more profit. But if you have a regulated monopoly and the monopolist finds a way to lower its cost by, say, 20%, the government is going to say, well, that's great that you lowered your cost by 20%. We're going to cut the price you can charge by 20%. So how much benefit does the regulated monopolist get from cutting, finding a way to cut their costs? They don't have any incentive. So a price control is one way to deal with monopoly. I don't think it's a very effective way to do it. Theoretically, it increases output, it increases consumer surplus, but it decreases the incentive to innovate and to get costs down. And I think that's a big problem. Some economists would say that those problems can be dealt with. I don't think it works very well. Government ownership is another way to deal with monopoly. Instead of having the electric company owned privately, the government can say, well, we're going to own it. This is what is done with TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, throughout the southeastern part of the country. Electric power production companies are owned by the Tennessee Valley Authority, which means it's owned by the government. So they're not trying to maximize profit. So you don't have the problems you have with an unregulated monopoly. Okay? But without competition, without a profit motive, what incentive do they have to be productive, or to be efficient? Okay? Not much incentive to be efficient, so they tend to become inefficient. Then the third means of dealing with monopoly is something called antitrust law. Antitrust laws are anti-monopoly laws. They are laws where the goal is to try to, you might say, increase competition, try to prevent things that will move us in the direction of monopoly. It is important to know these two names. The Sherman Act made certain anti-competitive acts illegal, and it was passed in 1890. Also, the Clayton Act was passed in 1914. It made certain other practices that were considered to be leading to monopoly, made those illegal. These laws give the federal government legal authority to prosecute monopolies or firms' attempts to monopolize. Under these laws, there are several things the government can do. The government can break up a monopoly. If you have a classic example was Standard Oil. Back in the early part of the 20th century, most oil produced in this country came from Standard Oil. Many of the oil companies today originally were a part of Standard Oil. They had, under some definitions, you could say they had a monopoly. Under the antitrust laws, the government can break up a monopoly. Now, it's important to recognize it's not illegal to be a monopoly. You can be broken up if the government can convince the courts that you have gained that monopoly in an anti-competitive way. Okay? For one thing, Rockefeller, who was the main force at Standard Oil, he had done some things that would be deemed anti-competitive. He was accused of using what's called predatory pricing, where you cut your prices so low that you're trying to impose cost on your competitors. You're hoping to drive them out of business so that you will have a monopoly. Okay? There's evidence that he probably did do some of that, but my conclusion is that most of his success was due to being very efficient. Anyway, the Standard Oil was broken up because they were deemed to have achieved monopoly status through anti-competitive means. The government can also prevent mergers. If you have an industry that has 3 main firms, and if 2 of them decide they want to merge, well, obviously, if when those firms are separate, they are competing with each other. If 2 of them merge, they're not competing with each other. So the idea is that if you, under certain circumstances, it will reduce competition if you allow a merger of some of the firms, because it's going to reduce the number of competitors in the market. If you had only 2 firms in the market and those 2 merged, obviously that would reduce competition. But what if it's 3 and 2 of them are merging? Or what if it's 10 and 2 of them are merging? Okay? It's not clear that that's a bad thing. What's important is the government does have the ability to prevent mergers under some circumstances. And the government does deem certain acts that are believed to reduce competition to be anti-competitive. We've just got a minute. I think it's important to recognize that although the antitrust laws are important, most economists would say, yeah, we should have antitrust laws. There have been many situations where the antitrust laws have been used in an anti-competitive way. One of the best examples was the Alcoa case, where Alcoa, aluminum company of America, they were essentially a monopoly, and they were charged with having violated antitrust law. And the government when they lost the case, and in explaining his ruling, the judge said that Alcoa prevented other firms from competing simply by being so efficient. Alcoa was so efficient, so good at producing their product at a low cost, that nobody else could compete with them, and that therefore they were guilty of violating antitrust law. Most people today would recognize that was a really bad decision. So antitrust law can be used in anti-competitive ways. It's designed to increase competition. If we're not careful, it can actually be used to reduce competition. Okay. Well, we just barely got to the end of chapter 13.